Part two of this reading is to actually acquire a central white space reading at this level. These are T1, T2, and T3. We know that the widest segment on T1 is a non-central white space thermometer, and therefore all of its segments narrower to it are also non-central white space thermometers. We do know that this one is a central white space thermometer, so in order to acquire a reading on T2, we start at the bottom of the segment on the narrowest segment, and the first thing we're going to do is maximally widen the segment and then perform an eye push-up where we move about half the distance. This helps the eye, it relaxes the combination, and move back to our standard reading distance. And now we're quickly evaluating whether since it's a vertical reading, we're looking for the temporal blur, and whether the temporal blur is wider than the central white space, which it appears to be, which gives the expectation that if we release the segment, that the central white space should be closing. We want to do this just after returning to our standard reading distance while the eye is still, the accommodation is still relaxed. So we're going to repeat the reading, moving down half the distance to the phone while just paying attention to the central white space, moving back, noting that the red blur appears to be slightly bigger than the white space, and then releasing it and noticing that the white space disappears. That defines that bottom segment as a non-central white space segment. Now we're going to be, there are three maneuvers which we'll get into, but initially if our first maneuver closes it off, then we know that we're dealing with a non-central white space segment. And again, close this off the white space. You can actually make your determination just on the size of the blur. Now at this point, the white space, the residual central white space appears to be slightly larger than the residual red blur, and we have a questionable white space there. So we're going to have to go on to our other two maneuvers. The next, for a non-dominant eye, the next thing is a 3-second pull and release, where we hold the white space open for 3 seconds, then quick release it, and at this point it appears to be closing out the white space. And then the last maneuver is to just gently go forward to see if a new white space presents itself, or if an existing questionable white space immediately widens. And this is on a non-widened segment, and we can see a new white space presenting itself as we get closer. This also defines this segment as a non-central white space. Again, we make the same maneuver, the first maneuver, move back to our standard reading distance, release. We can see just barely a central white space persisting. Now we're going to go to our 3-second pull and releases, where it does appear to have a central white space persisting after these maneuvers, although it's very faint. Now we're going to look at that faint residual white space and see if it immediately widens, which it does, as we approach the screen and then move back to see if it's persisting. So at this point, we've identified our first central white space segment, which in this case, 3 below it. That means it's 7 central white spaces. Since every segment wider than this should contain a central white space as well, but we can count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Identify 7 central white spaces, and then 1, 2 on T2. So our reading at this point would be 7 central white space segments on T2 as an initial central white space reading.